Then I would suggest we just start. Welcome everyone to our DKKV Lunch Talk series with CEDIM, the Center for Disaster Management and Risk Reduction Technology. As you know, our world is facing enormous challenges, so climate change, urbanization, growing dependence on critical infrastructure, all these things are making our society increasingly vulnerable to external disruptions such as natural hazards, but also technical risks. So there are many questions like how can risk be quantified holistically, or how can we effectively address diverse risks? What measures strengthen actually our resilience? And how can we respond appropriately in an emergency? With this series called Risk, Resilience and Response, experts from CEDIM will provide insights in their current research, innovative methods, practical approaches in the field of risk analysis, prevention, adaptation to extreme events in 10 compact online sessions, and we meet every second Monday from 12:30 to 1:30. And this is actually already our eighth session. If you missed any of the other sessions, feel free to watch them on YouTube later on. My name is Ronja Winkert-Enns. I'm working at DKKV as a research associate since 4 years already, and I'm very happy to moderate today's session. Today, we are looking into tourism at risk, adapting destination to climate and disaster challenges with Dr. Bijan Khazai. Bijan is CEO of Risk Layer and Hotel Resilience. I'm sure he will explain us a bit about what that is. He has over 20 years of experience as a scientist and practitioner in resilience planning, risk assessment, also risk reduction. He has led several international research projects and consultancies for communities, tourism destination, governments, also the private sector. And he has a lot of experience in developing resilient guidelines, standards, technology-driven solutions. He holds a PhD degree in civil and environmental engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, and he's a former senior scientist and faculty member of the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And with that, I would like to hand over to him. He will give a presentation, and afterwards, as always, we have lots of time for Q&A.
So much, Sonia, and very happy to be with everyone today. I hope you grabbed some coffee or lunch as it is during this lunch series. As Sonia mentioned, I used to be at KIT for actually 12 years, from 2006 to 2018, and we still, as a risk layer, keep a very strong affiliation with KIT, and particularly the Center for Disaster Management Risk Reduction Technology. I'm very happy to be with you today. And yes, I will talk about in our poly-crisis world, tourism as a sector is impacted, and would like to relay some project work that we've done in this particular sector. And hopefully, if you have questions later on the Q&A, I'll have the talk in English because the slides are in English, but happy also to answer. Certainly you can ask your questions in German and we can keep that part bilingual. Great. So I'm sure, as you've seen in many headlines around the world, tourism comes up quite often. The summer of 2024, a little bit around the corner now with all the snow that we've been getting. But, you might remember the 40-degree heats, wildfires in Greece, the historic droughts in northern Spain, where the water table dropped down to 15%, below its aquifer capacities. And this keeps happening. The wildfires in California. I was recently, 2024 in California on Highway 1. You couldn't pass it because of a major landslide blocking the way to Big Sur, and it's still not open. So there is no continuous way on Highway 1. There's a path in Switzerland where you can see how the glacier has been receding So with all of that, it's quite present in our mind, actually, and a lot of nice destinations around the world that people would like to go to travel to happen to be by beaches or and areas that are quite affected by disasters and climate change. In fact, if you look at sort of the global average distribution of risk, and you take that average and you take a standard deviation, no, you take 5 standard deviations, and above the mean, that affects 10% of all of destinations. So we did this exercise and we saw, okay, that how many travelers go to these 10%? Turned out 180 million traveler abouts travel to these 10%, 5 standard deviations about average risk, which accounts to 8% of the global tourism expenditure. So that's a number to hang a hat on to see, okay, what could be impacted in terms of financials. And otherwise, you have to think, okay, with this, you're going to have increased operating costs, increased financial losses. Insurability becomes the question, as the wildfires and the floods in the US showed. And there's some decisions to be made by destination managers and stakeholders as to the reputation of their destinations as we keep having impacts of climate change and disasters. In fact, we did a work for 2 years with Visit California, which is a tourism board for the state of California and is responsible for actually marketing the state as a tourism destination. And this project was on resilience and sustainability of the state. And about 150 stakeholders were involved in this work. We did these interviews to kind of see, and we scored them, and 1 would be a low score and 5 would be the highest possible score. What is on average the perception among these tourism stakeholders? These are not disaster managers. These are, destination management organizations. These are restaurant, hotel owners. These are people who are working in the everyday tourism field. And if you look here, you see at least 1 green and a bunch of yellows, which are a little bit higher than average scores in terms of perception of the impacts of climate change on tourism. So those perceptions are high or relatively high. They scored well on that. But if you go down in terms of access of data on risk for tourism or sharing of that data amongst each other, they scored much more poorly. So they understand that's an issue. And the problem is not that there is a lack of data. In fact, especially in the United States, in the state of California, there is lots of data. But this data often is stovepiped and kept up in inaccessible formats. Universities have them, insurance has them. Some, scientific organizations might have access to this data, but it's not being shared. And it's not being shared, importantly, in a format and through metrics that are relevant to these tourism stakeholders. So if I want to know, for example, how much less snowfall am I going to get in these resorts at Lake Tahoe and up in the Sierras, or how much will that result into loss of income for me in terms of an infrastructure risk, I won't have metrics on that. So that's the data that would really translate into decision-making for tourism stakeholders. So that we're drowning in data, but we're starving for clarity. The other issue is that we've come quite a ways in sustainability because we have now these standard frameworks. One of them that's globally accepted now is the Global Sustainability and Tourism Criteria. So destinations now follow standards, hotels follow standards, and there's labels around to see how we can certify to be sustainable. And there's a market value to that as well. Not so much with resilience. There is no agreement on what is a standard for what makes a destination or a hotel resilient. In fact, 2016 through Hotel Resilient, Rania mentioned it, the GIZ, the United Nations Pacific Asia Tourism Association, got KIT involved to put those standards together. We did develop them. That's how Hotel Resilient came about. But we're still a long way from having that really used and accepted as an international norm, the way sustainability criteria are being understood that way. And if you think about the motives, it also becomes a little clear, right? Sustainability is good. I want to show that we're green, that we're recycling, that we don't use, a single-use plastic. But when it comes to risk, there is the worry that I'm going to reveal some weaknesses in my disaster preparedness. It's going to affect my insurance terms, my public image. It's going to tarnish the reputation of my destination. Investors won't be as confident. So it's hard to get destinations really aligned because they don't see it yet as a competitive advantage. And that's the part that we need to work on. And I'll bring up some ideas for that throughout my talk. The third one, and I'm identifying some of the gaps that we see through our work, is that tourism is really not at the table. So in terms of decision making when it comes to disaster preparedness and climate change adaptation, again, referring back to this study or work that we did with Visit California, you ask these 150 stakeholders, very few of them are in the committees, if any, actually, that put together the disaster risk reduction plan that every county in the state of California, in fact, in the continental US, is required to have. So there's these long documents, quite some detail. They're a little bit different, but they have to follow a certain outline. And tourism is really absent from preparing that plan and for having contingencies in what happens when an event when an event takes place, what happens to the tourism infrastructure, what happens to visitors. They're not really integrated in that process. So we're still, as a tourism sector, really in this reactive crisis response mode. And this proactive thinking of actually disaster risk management planning, climate change adaptation hasn't really trickled to the sector in the way that it could, particularly because the sector is so vulnerable and is front affected by any kind of major crisis. So I wanted to identify those as sort of, there's lots more, but three kind of key areas if you wanted to describe challenges that we face. So one is starving for clarity, but no lack of data. The other is that there is no standardized way of looking at resilience. It's actually seen as a disadvantage to be open and transparent. And then tourism is not at the table. But perhaps more interestingly, and for the rest of this talk, I want to talk about opportunities in addressing these kinds of gaps that we have. So how do we bridge this data to action divide? How do we make this information that we know is there? A lot of it is actually open data, open source models. How can we make this more relevant to tourism? I have some ideas there through some projects that we've been involved with. The other is, what are some ways to actually look at financial risk transfer that is customized and targeted to the tourism sector? So there are some ideas there. And then what are opportunities to reframe resilience actually as a competitive strategy rather than looking at it as a liability? So let's get into it. So I'm going to divide this into three parts, talk about project examples for each one of these areas, and some of the work that we've been involved with will come through hopefully this way. So how this data to action divide. One thing that's missing is a global platform that is open, that's really available, that tourism stakeholders know about, where they can access information on risk, not just climate hazards or earthquake, or landslides, and this and that are available through various global initiatives, but actually one place that is targeted for tourism stakeholders and actually talks about tourism risk, not just hazard and exposure. So the Travel Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization, put together this initiative. It involves some Dutch universities. You can see the number of different partners: the European Tourism Futures Institute, Breda University, Tourism Canada is involved, and Riskclear is the entity that is putting together all the modeling for this project. So we're bringing in our expertise to develop a global tourism risk map, in fact, and also put an online platform together that displays this information. And this has 6 pilot destinations. So the idea is to have one global database and an interactive map but then also drill deeper and go into 6 destinations and actually go towards resiliency planning in those. Some of the outcomes of this have already been shown in the COP30, but the project is underway. We're at mid-stage now. Everything will be completed by the end of 2026. So the idea, as I said, is to assess exposure across different types of tourism assets, and then quantify these results into risk and resilience scores. And it will be a traffic light system. So, it will be an index. It won't be a loss value. But at this stage, for the database to be globally available, we had to make some simplifying assumptions, and we'll deliver a risk band and a resilience score that can then be interactive, and I'll talk about how it's interactive. And then we'll bring in some resilience champions, some destinations who are actually implementing resilience strategies in their destinations. Those would be the pilots, where they can highlight some of their work and how they're going about resilience strategies for others to learn from this and transfer lessons that way. Here is with the help of AI, a little conceptual diagram that brings our methodology together. And there's 3 steps to this. So one is dividing the globe into different types of destinations. We know that not all tourism destinations are the same. Some are urban, some are coastal, some are mountain, some are natural asset based. This is actually based on a accepted definition of tourism typologies. We can go into a little bit more nuanced ones as well, but for the purposes of this work, we have 4 typologies, and you can imagine any destination can have a mixture of these typologies too. So it could be, both mountain and natural asset base. It could be an urban coastal destination, and the methodology actually looks at percentage that is included in each 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer pixel for the globe. And then we're going to throw a global climate hazard model at it. So this is another 10 kilometer resolution grid that is the latest climate models by IPCC, so the CMIP6 models, and we're going to look at 70 different climate parameters, integrate that into a number of different climate indices, so heat, floods, wildfire, and more. And we're not just going to look at it generically. A big part of this is actually look at tourism exposure. So where are the hotels? Where is the tourism GDP? Where are the beaches? And how is tourism assets impacted by this? It's not a loss value that comes out in the end, but it's an index that integrates hazard, tourism exposure. And then for this global output that it will be available openly, there is no destination level vulnerability, because that would be quite a bit of work and it can't be done globally. That's the pilot work. But we're going to look at the host country. And the host country, you'd imagine if something is vulnerable in the Philippines, maybe Bohol as a destination there is somewhat in that band of vulnerability drivers, or whatever could make the Philippines as a country vulnerable could impact Bohol. So we're going to look at the infrastructure, food security, health, other types of physical risk vulnerability drivers due to climate change. And we'll also look at transition risks, like the energy policy of the country. And those would be the vulnerability drivers. So we're looking at sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and the exposure at the host country level. But then we also want to see how ready the country is in terms of its climate change adaptation, socially, economically, and through governance indicators. So this is lots of indicators that come together that describe the host country in terms of its vulnerability and readiness. Then you had in step 1, the destination in terms of the tourism exposure and hazards. You bring all of that together, and we can look at a unified risk score for that destination. And it's meant to be at least a first level analysis for any destination to go into and say, okay, we can pick it up from here, maybe put in our own indicators at the destination and start actually bringing in some planning mechanisms now. So the first stage of this is actually going through the world and looking at where are the mountains, where are the coasts, where are the urban areas, where are the nature-based assets. So a lot of different data sets have been combined to develop these maps and kind of divide this. These are admin 2 zones for the world into what would be the dominant destination typology. Of course, any one of these is mixed but you can actually show the dominant ones as well if you wanted to. And then it's really the exposure of tourism assets that's key. And this is an area where Riskler has been quite active in. So we've put together 1.5 million hotels that are geocoded and footprinted globally. There's a global wineries database. There's a global beach database that we've put together. And importantly, we've looked at the share of GDPs in countries subnationally where tourism is contributing. So at an admin 2 level, we can actually look at the income of tourism as a share of the GDP of the country. And all of this is published work. And there's some own products that are derivatives of this, which has also been done. We could look at the financial losses of beaches just by looking at how they're impacted by tsunamis, like this work that we did with CEDIM a while back now. Or we can look at the losses from wineries from multiple types of hazards, but these are different stories we don't want to get into, just to show that there's a lot of different data sets that come together to ultimately produce this view of risk at a global level for tourism. So that's the idea. This is what will be available this year. So anyone could go and start looking at tourism risks in their destinations. And then they can go and interact with these indicators at the host country level, weight them differently if they wanted to, and see how much more. So we're talking about risk, but actually there's a whole resilience piece here, right? We're looking at the readiness of the host country. What is the readiness of the destination? So you can introduce your own indicators of readiness at the destination level and start seeing what can I do about these risks, or where are some hot spots of risks that I need to worry about, maybe, and start getting into planning. It's not quite planning yet, but it's the first level data that could be relevant to tourism stakeholders. And the result could be something like this. It could be a ranking of different countries. These are Caribbean nations, 22 Caribbean nations that have been analyzed by these different risk factors. And you could start looking at where are they getting their exposure from, and start getting into these types of analyses, even with this kind of high-level indexing. But really getting into the next level is to say, okay, an index is good. It helps me kind of understand in a semi-quantitative way and quantitative way where my distribution of risk could be, where the hotspots are, but it doesn't really help me with any kind of financial planning. That's where I really need to go to loss. And that's where financing and risk transfer becomes really important. So I wanted to show you some examples of some work that we've done there, and then some ideas of tourism targeted risk transfer products. So this is going back again to the work we did with the state of California. We said, let's look at all the hotels in the state, so just accommodations, and let's see what would be the losses to the hotel sector from different types of hazards. This is not climate change, it's just hazards. So you can see earthquakes really dominate the profile here, even though wildfires in the news, floods are in the news, but state of California, San Andreas Fault is a tectonically active state, and the major earthquake, which is pending, if that happens, it's going to have some dramatic effects. And if you distributed this loss on average annually, then you're talking about 370 million US dollars every year. Of course, it's not going to happen every year. Then it's going to be a much bigger number whenever it happens. But 370 million every year just in hotel losses from earthquakes alone. Now, if you think about the state's GDP of 4 trillion, I believe it is, that's a small, very small dent. But if you think about that in terms of tourism revenues, 2024 was about 160 billion. Then it's not so much of a small dent. So it's noticeable. And it's worth thinking about how do we protect assets and think about insurance mechanisms that can look towards the future, and kind of are targeted for the sector. And again, if you wanted to break this down, not every region is exposed the same way. Of course, the urban regions, Los Angeles, San Francisco, really come out because that's where a lot of your exposure is. But you can also kind of think about what are your most exposed areas and what could be some tools. But the first thing you need is numbers and kind of see what would be the costs, what could be the benefits of any kind of financial transfer solutions. Now, this was just for information we did for the state of California, but a project with Howden, which is a reinsurance and an insurance broker and a reinsurance outfit, has ability then to mobilize different investors into looking at solutions. So we did this project with them. And here we looked at small island developing states. So you can see the list of countries that we looked at from Fiji to St. Lucia. And we looked at climate change and how risk from floods, droughts, bushfires, storm surge, and cyclones might increase from today's conditions to 2050. And here, the idea is that these countries are quite exposed. They're big tourism countries, so a lot of their revenues is coming from tourism. And what if they pool together for sort of the innovation here would be they would come together and they would say, let's all chip in and pay an annual premium. And for that, we'll have what's called a stop loss program. So up to anything above 10% of my GDP in terms of losses will then be covered. And all I have to try to do, or what I have to do, is cover up to that 10% mark. So it becomes a little bit more manageable. That's that layer that the countries can cover. And what would be the premium that's required to pay into? So it turns out with these 11 SIDS, if they each put in, collectively 314 million in terms of annual premiums, they could cover up to 22 billion in losses through this modeling work that we did. And if you're Tuvalu and you're looking at, 7% of your GDP already, in the bottom graph, I'm showing all of these losses combined. So if you look at Tuvalu and you look at the purple bar, that's today's conditions. That's 7% of your GDP is already annually expected to be at loss. And that increases by somewhere upwards of 11% by 2050. You say, okay, here we are, something worth thinking about in terms of a mechanism. And what's interesting here is that you can leverage donor support, you can leverage capital markets for so-called climate bonds and try to bring in donor-supported premiums. So even for the premiums that these countries need to put up, this is where donor funding can also come in. But again, the first part of this is actually getting the numbers and being able to show the picture. And that's where risk layer comes in. And then it's Howden and people that are more capable and work with these financial tools that can then shape the programs. But that's one example of a program that we were involved in. So again, to put this in a picture and how something like this could work, and many of you may have seen these types of risk layers before, but the idea is, you kind of segregate your risk profile. So you're talking about high frequency, low severity events that may have less losses. And here, maybe I'm going to retain some of this risk and look at a self-financing strategy. This is where the layer that's often covered by businesses, they absorb these losses themselves through their savings or operating budgets. This is pure risk retention. But if you move up, the next layer is your private sector risk transfer. So here's where there's a lot of different insurance products, some traditional insurance models that handle more frequent, moderate losses. Sometimes these are supported by government subsidies, in some cases not, but the responsibility of the payouts is with the insurers, whose solvency is now protected by lots of regulation. Now, if you go above that, that's where there is lots of room for innovation. And this is the previous slide that I showed you about the SIDS, where you're talking about larger, less frequent losses, but you're talking about huge numbers here, upwards of 10% of a country's GDP, perhaps, where you can really think about moving into public sector risk transfer and combine this with prearranged public funds, insurance pools, cat bonds, climate bonds. And here there's lots of room for collaboration, cooperation, groups to come together and follow clear rules in capital markets to multiply public resources to be able to protect for these types of losses in countries that are extremely vulnerable. And at the top is kind of the rarest, most severe disasters. There's always going to be some residual risk, and this is often ad hoc national or international emergency relief as a last resort, safety when net, when predefined mechanisms are exceeded. And okay, so I'm going to try to wrap up a little bit now, leave us a bit of time also for Q&A. But this is the third area that I said where we have opportunities. All this is good. So first level and understanding of the distribution of risk to start thinking about at least what my vulnerabilities are, where can I be doing something, then actually put some numbers, some loss figures behind it and talk about risk transfer. But how do we then think about it as an industry where it's currently a tarnish on the reputation to be open about your risk? How do we turn resilience into a competitive strategy? And more we see tourism destinations actually asking for resilience plans to be developed for them. So we just finished some work with Destination Canada. And this is many different corridors that we did this, but one example that I wanted to highlight here is for a cycle corridor. So the state of Quebec and Ontario in Canada, or the provinces, there wanted to put together a cycling path, connect actually a bunch of existing cycling paths and really promote cycling as a tourism activity and their destinations through that. And they figured, let's look at climate impacts on these cycling corridors. And here, let's talk about how, what could make these cycling corridors more vulnerable and what would be some resilience initiatives to help reduce those vulnerabilities and strengthen resilience. So first this is kind of the area that we're talking about from Ottawa to Montreal, different paths that connect these two cities together, different routes, and then really throw all the modeling tools that we have at it and start looking at, how climate affects this. This was also purely looking at climate-related risks, nothing geophysical. So one thing that we know with cycling, it gets uncomfortable when temperatures exceed 30 degrees. So between today's conditions and those by 2050 and 2070, we wanted to see how much more heat are we supposed to expect. So when we looked at this, we're going to triple the number of days that are above 30 degrees Celsius by 2050. And we're going to have more than 50 days higher than 30 degrees by 2070 in this corridor, which is quite a significant increase in extreme heat, which makes cycling uncomfortable and for some actually poses severe health risks as well. So heat and humidity clearly a factor, and we wanted to see, how much more is that a factor? So put again some clear numbers there. Then we wanted to see what sections of this cycling corridor is going to get flooded. What's the flooding susceptibility? And in fact, what tourism assets are going to be impacted? So we looked at, and up here you can see campsites, accommodations, travel services. Each of these bars in different colors shows one of these different types of tourism assets. Of course, the food and beverage sites, recreation and entertainment along these routes. And you can see most of the distribution of flood is between low and high, but what we're really interested here is high to extreme increase in flooding and in these different, so identify those hotspots for any type of risk mitigation and resilience activities to disaggregate these assets into risk profiles. Another type of hazard that the stakeholders were really concerned about is wildfire. This is both in terms of direct impact, but also in terms of smoke from nearby fires, which impacts cycling conditions and people's desire to be on these routes. And so I won't go into all of this, but here is a few, again, bar charts looking at distribution of direct impacts of wildfires through wildfire models in terms of low, moderate sort of traffic light system, where some of the most ice risk spots would be for wildfire. And then we also looked at drier conditions. That's actually a favorable climate variable because that could create more comfortable riding weather, particularly in regions like that, all of Ontario and Quebec that could experience high humidity in the summers. We looked at precipitations and a number of other different factors. I won't list all of them, but ultimately the idea was to also put together a cycling suitability index due to climate change. And what shows up here is quite interesting, is that you have, your typical season, which is being marketed currently for the cycling was the summer, so June to August. But that actually, with climate change, turns out to be less desirable. And in fact, you have a shoulder seasons in May, March to May, and starting in September to end of October, where you could think about these shoulder seasons as being revisioned as more attractive due to increased heat with climate change for cycling. So that's one important finding, is how do we kind of use numbers to actually move our high season to these shoulder seasons, and where should we plan for these shoulder seasons, and reduce this peak season reliance because of these increased climate conditions that are unfavorable for cycling. And then put all of this together in a plan. And this plan had 8 different action areas. I'm just going to show 2 of them here. But one, of course, was to look at, did I skip one? Oops. Yeah, I skipped one by accident. Is, as I mentioned, promote year-round diversified tourism. So moving to these shoulder seasons from peak season, and promote spring and fall over hot, smoky summers. And how do we actually, in marketing language, translate that? So you talk about the wonderful fall blooms and foliage and the mild weather, and this translates into a number of action areas which go beyond the work that we're doing into actually looking at marketing the off seasons and shoulder seasons. And you design the itineraries, and this gets into working areas that the tourism stakeholders can deal with, but they needed those actual facts and figures for that to happen. And another area you can imagine, where once you've identified sections of these corridors that are more highly exposed to risks, is actually putting together flood-resistant trail designs. How do you protect for storm and erosion? How do you provide more shade and mitigate heat by, for example, planting canopy trees, adding shelters, prioritizing shade along exposed corridors, etc. And then how do you think about sort of materials that you want to use in some of these trails that are not fully developed yet, or looking at infrastructure upgrading by looking at things like post-storm, even softer measures like postponed inspection protocols. How do you make sure the emergency vehicles can access these areas? All the way into putting, actually, and this was the one of the key recommendations, is to put a committee of tourism stakeholders for this infrastructure, and that looked at climate resiliency as one of their key prerogatives. So a lot more that can be said about these things, but hopefully this gives you, in the short time that I have, a sense for how you translate some of these quantifiable risk metrics into action plans that connect into this. And with that, I also really wanted to conclude. So I see one of the main challenges in the tourism field is reframing resilience as a competitive strategy, but hopefully by distilling and showing the risks in meaningful, actionable terms, where the costs are become really easy to understand to the tourism stakeholders, you can motivate them to be taking action. That's one thing. So, and the other thing is, through better standards and sort of more innovations in both the risk transfer solutions and those groups that are now looking investors, particularly for tourism sector, along with all other sectors, to disclose their risks for them to qualify for investments. That could be sort of the stick approach, where regulation is put into place and tourism stakeholders are then required by law to disclose their risks in order to qualify for different types of investments that they are going for. And I think that's together by the initiatives of tourism stakeholders themselves, seeing that there is value in investing to protect their investment, and then them also being held to account by the market forces that exist, could be something that we're seeing more and more now, and hopefully in the next years for the tourism sector to bring resilience into the mainstream of its planning mechanisms, much the same way sustainability has come to be accepted and a way of life among many tourism stakeholders. So in effect, resilience has to shift from a cost liability to a value proposition. And it's also clear from all the events that we hear in the news that destinations that are planning now can avoid being blindsided by these compounding risks. And there are those destinations that don't, and those are going to be, unfortunately, more and more of those in the headlines as we go towards different climate regimes. With that, I think I've left us a few more minutes to have some questions and answers, hopefully. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bijan. Really insightful. I'll have a look into our audience. Are there any questions? Feel free to either raise your hand and put the question directly to Bijan, or you can also use the chat. There's Lucas.
Hi, Ronja, and hi, everyone. I'm here having lunch with some UNDR colleagues, and we'd be very interested. Thanks, Bijan, for the presentation and sharing all that work you've done. On first, why you pursued like that risk transfer thing in the end? Is it that kind of insurance to hotels and the tourism kind of operators is more interesting than doing prevention, or if it was just like a bias in your presentation? And then on the insurance specifically, have you kind of made it that the premiums are reduced when a hotel takes prevention activities? I know you had discussions on that. Did it work finally? And if not, why does the premium not go down if you have certain kind of preventive measures in place? So that's something we'd be interested in. And then also if you have an example on where like a tourism destination took really forward the prevention work. Thanks a lot.
Lucas, very packed set of questions, but I'll do my best to pick them apart a little bit. So yes, this is like a multifold number of things that are available to you, like in a arsenal of tools that you have. So obviously, risk transfer is not the end-all be-all solution, but it's an important piece, and it was an opportunity for us to work with a major stakeholder like Howden, who is in this area, and I wanted to posit that as one opportunity where we have a lot of innovation possibility, but certainly not as the only means, and not to replace mitigation and prevention work that the industry can be doing. And what I also like to do is separate some of the work, because you asked about hotels and premiums that hotels pay, and the work that I was showing you is really at the country scale, right? So it's these small island developing states coming together as a pool of resources that they can pull together. And then the question that was on the table is, what is actually our liability? What is the cost if climate really hits us in terms of a % of our GDP? And the opportunity there, and this was really, the program has not been implemented yet, but it was also just finished. But that it was the first step to get donors behind and say, look, we've determined that, you saw with Tuvalu, that we're already going to be exceeding 10% GDP. And if you put that as your as your stopgap is what is needed in terms of premiums to be coming in order for the industry, the private sector, to come in and develop like a reinsurance scheme around that. And those were the numbers that were needed, and that's why risk layer expertise was brought in. But it was picked up, we displayed it in COP, and there was a lot of interest to go in this direction. It will be some work to actually get it off the ground. So it's not a complete program yet, but I think it has a lot of potential to hopefully also get the donor funding in that's required for these countries, because it would be really difficult for them to come up with the premiums. With the hotels, which is a separate question I think you asked, we also have done some work. The whole idea there is an individual hotel, or let's say my naive idea when we started this work in 2016 was, if we have a standard where a hotel can show transparently to an insurer that it's reducing its risks, either operationally or through improvements in infrastructure, just simply being able to ensure better business continuity, can that result into reduced premiums from the insurer? And the answer to that is no. That's not how insurance works. And they essentially use the law of moving averages and have these portfolios and distribute their risks and have their own way of determining premiums. And they're not interested in what a hotel is doing to provide them better premiums. However, they are interested in picking up more hotels that they can insure. So they said to us, if Hotel Resilient can come up with 1,000 hotels at least that are using the standard, and you connect them to us, then we can start coming up with solutions that are targeted to these hotels. We'll still use our own ways of calculating premiums, but there could be a discount that is possible as these hotels come together. And so this is really not a satisfying answer to your question, because it's not using the transparent work the hotel is doing to actually be showing that it's reducing its risk, but it's a way for insurance to essentially market its insurance to more hotels. So that's the stage where we're at. But I haven't given up hope in this idea that more transparent demonstration of reducing your risk can translate into something that is not just used by insurance to create a better market for itself. And my hope is here in the task force for financial climate risk disclosure, TCFD. And really here we have the elements where business owners, especially we're talking about major chains and bigger hotels, which are liable to actually demonstrate their transition risks and their physical risks and what they're doing about it. And these are really difficult things to put in place. So if we can help them put these things in place, that means they get better investment, they're more attractive. And so here is a real incentive for these hotel operators to come together and use these tools to be able to take something that is quite costly for them to do, not to mention the administrative and the expertise needed to put a plan like that together, and support them with that process. And the idea would be to connect them with better terms on investments. So that's kind of where we're at with Hotel Resilient at the moment. We had to take a big detour around the world of sustainability, long reasons I won't get into, but that's essentially created the Hotel Resilient space, because now we have over 1,000 hotels into the platform, sharing data with each other, with tour operators, with destination management companies, and it's putting together the resilience profile of these hotels is now a doable thing, whereas before we were really struggling with getting hotels interested in this in the first place. Hopefully I answered a little bit of what you asked, Lucas, and didn't leave too much out.
It looks like the sum was up. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I would jump in. So you presented Destination Canada. How does it actually work that you come together? Is it Destination Canada that says, hey, Bijan, can you do that for us? Or is it rather you approaching the different countries?
Yes, excellent question. It used to be us approaching, and it was like, the unicorn destination that actually was interested in this. But more and more destinations understand the value in this. And Destination Canada actually approached us, or they put together a RFP for companies that can help them look at resilience planning for these. They had 4 tourism corridors. And I just showed you one, and each one had a different focus. So one was agritourism, one was cycling, marine tourism, and all of these are impacted by climate change. And they wanted to see, in the face of climate change, how can they be more resilient? So that was actually the terms of the RFP. And we applied for it and we got involved and we started doing this. And more I see these types of requests for proposal coming out, whereas before it was a rarity. And now through the work that we're doing with the Travel Foundation, and hopefully through this development of the global risk scan platform, where destinations can actually be informed about the risk, there'll be more and more interest by destinations themselves coming and say, okay, now that you told us, a little bit about what our risks are, what can we do about it? And then get really more into this kind of resilience strategies and planning tools.
And are they like giving the information gained from your work directly to the tourists? So your cycling experience will be impacted by climate change in the following ways. So please behave in this and this way.
That's maybe at some point down the line, but that's not really the way this information is being used. So what they have is a task force already that's put in place on sustainability and resilience. And the job of that task force is to take the study that we did, the work that we did, and integrate that into the corridors development strategy. So the corridors development strategy has many different components. That's looking at marketing, it's looking at, business supplies and supply chain effects and all sorts of things. And to make sure that tourism is at the table, where, I mentioned that's one of the gaps, is to make sure that there's a task force that understands this, that is well versed into these metrics and can integrate that into the greater development strategy. And that was a big part of our work, is to actually translate our analytics into different elements that can work in the development strategy. And 2 of those I showed you, like how we need to develop the corridor to be flood resilient, and what could be different ways of doing that. So that was one key piece of it. And how do we move peak season off to shoulder seasons? What would be the right season? And what are the implications of concentrating everything in the peak season?
Okay, thank you. We have one question in the chat regarding the cruise ship industry. Are there any involvements planned, and if yes, how?
On the cruise ship, and they're kind of operating in their own subsector, even with sustainability. They're not really following a lot of the sustainability standards that GSCC, for example, has for accommodations. It's a tricky one. So I don't have direct experience working with them, but just recently I know there's another group that was answering a call by the cruise ship sector to look at risks that they're facing. So I know that there is some interest in that sector too, but it's not a sector I have much experience with, unfortunately.
Okay, well, we'll see if they get on track soon. I guess we would have room for one last question. Let's see if someone else wants to comment or ask something.
Ronja, we have another one here. I'm just not able to raise my hand. I'm too slow.
Okay.
I think no, just one consideration. Have you taken into account in your analysis environmental hazards? For instance, in the Caribbean region, we know one of the biggest problems that the tourist sector are facing right now is sargassum intrusion. Hotels like the Marriott, for instance, and Kitts and Nevis are paying more than $1 million per year to manage sargassum, because having sargassum on the beach means less customers. So how is this included in your analysis environmental hazards? And I guess that a good discussion will follow up later on, notably on the question of Lucas about starting with risk transfer but not finishing with risk transfer, knowing that the most important for the tourist sector is reducing the vulnerability of their internal clients or the clients in general and the exposure to multiple hazards. But just the question on environmental hazards. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It's actually a very timely question. We don't internally have maybe yet, or we don't have the expertise, we don't have it yet to address environmental hazards as such, but we are very much looking towards collaborations there. I've definitely heard about the Caribbean risk, but one area where we're looking at algal bloom in Australia in the coastal areas. That's a huge problem, and it's similar to what you've mentioned. So a lot of beaches are essentially not usable because of the algal blooms, and what would be mitigation actions to reduce the algae there. So that's an area where we don't have the expertise, but we're collecting that expertise with partners to come up with a holistic solution there, because there's some climate change implications there as well. One area where we have looked at is biodiversity loss. So in fact, one of the indicators in the Global Risk Scan project is current biodiversity loss indicators. And we want to see with climate change, for example, higher temperatures in the seas, how could marine life be affected, and map that information out. So there's some work that we're doing, particularly when the environmental impact is correlated or connected to climate change drivers. There's an opportunity for RiskLayer to collaborate with environmental scientists and come up with solutions there. But we're not environmental scientists as such, so we don't have that expertise in-house. To answer your question, and the second part, I think that's really where the key is how do we get the sector to think about actually reducing the vulnerability of their exposed assets. And at least I think the first thing we have to do is get them to understand how vulnerable and how exposed they are, because even that is not, in this work that we did with California, this risk perception was really funny because, everyone understands climate is impacting them, but how is it impacting you? Where is it impacting you spatially? What areas are being impacted more, and to what extent? And I think once that information is communicated in terms of metrics that mean something to them, then you can convince them, hopefully, to start taking a little bit more action. And I know we've been doing this for decades now in general, but I think the proposition here is to think about sector-specific solutions with metrics that are meaningful to that sector, and with networks that are aligned with the interests of that sector, and moving into that space a little bit more heavily than we have in the past, with a lot of sort of more generic tools. And that's kind of where the effort is now, at least in the work that we're doing with the Travel Foundation.
Okay, I hope that answered the questions of the UNDRR guys. With that, we come to an end. As you know, this is a series, so the series will go on. In 2 weeks, on the 26th of January, we will meet again at 12:30 with the topic of AI. It will be in German with Dr. Sadib Ottenburger, and the topic is: Wie kann generative KI zur Verbesserung der Systemresilienz beitragen? Und das ist ein interdisziplinärer Ansatz. With that, I thank you very, very much that you participated. You'll find the link to register for the next event in the chat, as well as the link to our YouTube video channel where you can look all the past events again. Have a good day, enjoy, and see you soon. Bye-bye.